Welcome to our spectacular new home here at 555 Pennsylvania Avenue with a spectacular view in the back and a spectacular group of speakers today and a spectacular audience, which is all of you. So great to be here with you on this very special occasion. So as you look around and you look at what do we all have in common? We're all deans, right? And so I was trying to think, there are all these words of venery, but you describe a group of things, the pride of lions and things like that. And what would you use to describe a group of deans? And I thought, well, I tossed some things in my mind, and I think a deeply challenged of genes, right, is what we might characterize ourselves. I don't know if my colleagues would share that characterization, but it is a privilege to be here with one current colleague and one predecessor colleague, but also a colleague in many other respects, Dean Cohen and of course Dean Long, for this very special occasion to celebrate and to hear about Eliot's book. For this audience, I know I don't have to give much of an introduction to Eliot, especially since we have so many of the members of the SAIS board here. Well known to all of us in a distinguished career both as a scholar and as a practitioner, and it is a truth which would be self-evident that Eliot and I never served in the same administration for reasons which you can guess. We've served collaboratively as the loyal-ish oppositions in each other's administrations, and of course, a legendary scholar, teacher here at SAIS for so many years and much beloved of so many generations of SAIS students, but also especially for the SAIS community, who not perhaps had the chance to meet Dean Long yet. Dean Long is the Sheridan Dean of the University Libraries, Archives, and Museums here at Johns Hopkins University, which is an extraordinarily important feature of our life here at Johns Hopkins, and really one of the distinguishing features of Johns Hopkins, because the Sheridan Libraries is such a remarkable and special collection, and I know we have some elements of that here with us tonight. But she's had a really distinguished career as a university librarian, coming to us from the University of Chicago, where she had many very important roles and has been really an innovator in library sciences and the use of technology in particular to support libraries. And it's especially important to us because, as the SAIS hands will know here, as we came to 555, our library, the Mason Library, became part of the Sheridan Libraries. And so we are very dependent on the goodwill and support of the university libraries as a whole, and we get tremendous support from Dean Long and her team. So delighted to be here. My only words of introduction about the book is simply to say that this is an important book that looks at how literature and other aspects of culture can illuminate international relations and international affairs. It is a companion to an equally significant book, which once you finish this, I want you to run out and read, which is called The Politics of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which explores similar lessons that can be learned from a different form of culture about international relations. There's also, as some of you will know, our good friend Dan Dresner has written extensively about Star Wars and the lessons you can learn about international relations in Star Wars. But this, of course, this is Shakespeare, and it's more important. And my last remarks will say is that it's especially resonant for me because some of you know about my career, various things I've done in my career, but the most important part was when I was in high school, I also, like so many people, was an aspiring thespian. And one of the first plays that I acted in was Lear. Now, I was quite junior, and for reasons that are obvious, never became a thespian, so I did not have a major part. Indeed, I played most of the minor actors in the play because this was high school and we didn't have a lot of people to do it. But my most significant of the minor actors I played was the King of France, which of course was something interesting if you think about my future career in international relations. But the best thing about having played King of France is he's one of the few really good guys in the play, right? So it's... So I take a great particular pleasure in this. I look forward to the conversation, and I will just say I have challenged Eliot to explain at some point in the course of the evening why he sees an analogy between President Lincoln and Henry IV. So with that, I turn it over to Dean Cohen.
Well, thank you, Dean Steinberg. I think I would have, I mean, based on my own experience, I would have called it a quiet desperation of deans. But thank you all so much for being here. Dean Long, really, this is wonderful. And everybody from the library and so many old friends, members of the Board of Advisors, former students. It's really just a delight to be here with all of you. So I'm going to say a few words about the book. And I want to begin with an obvious, if somewhat embarrassing question, which is, why did a foreign policy, military historian, former dean, pretendee diplomat write a book about Shakespeare? And the answer is, because it was fun, and being a full professor on the verge of emeritus status, I can get away with it. And there's a certain amount of truth to that, but there's more to it. So let me begin at the beginning, which is when my wife Judy and I went to the Folger Theater. And of course, Washington is blessed having not one, but two Shakespeare theaters. And we saw a production of Henry VIII. And you know, there used to be some doubt. It was the Shakespeare, is it Shakespeare in collaboration? There's at least one speech which is entirely Shakespeare. And it's when Cardinal Wolsey, who is basically the equivalent of the prime minister of Henry VIII, is suddenly deposed. And he gives the following speech. Farewell, a long farewell to all my greatness. This is the state of man. Today he puts forth the tender leaves of hopes. Tomorrow blossoms and bears his blushing honors thick upon him. The third day comes a frost, a killing frost. And when he thinks, good easy man, full surely his greatness is a ripening, nips his root, and then he falls as I do. I have ventured like little wanton boys that swim on bladders this many summers in a sea of glory, but far beyond my depth. My high-blown pride at length broke under me, and now has left me, weary and old with service, to the mercy of a rude stream that must forever hide me. O Cromwell, Cromwell, had I but served my God with half the zeal I served my king, he would not in mine age have left me naked to mine enemies. I listened to that speech and I said, I know that guy. Lots of people in Washington swim in a sea of glory and, alas, often beyond their depth. So that led to discussions with students, it led to a set of courses, it led to the book. So why do I think I have something to say? Well, I mean, one answer might be that it's one thing to read about Richard II and Iago and Goneril, or see them on the stage. I've had to work with some of those people, or at least observe them closely. And most literature professors don't get that opportunity, and most politicians or deans, ours is an exception, don't have enough Shakespeare to make the connections. And that's why the book weaves in a discussion of Shakespeare's plays with political, even a certain amount of business history, and even something of my own experience as a government official and a dean. Now, Washingtonians and politicians above all have always loved Shakespeare. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen House of Cards, either the American version with Kevin Spacey or the infinitely superior British version with Ian Richardson, who just does Sinister so well. In both cases, this was a ripoff of Richard III. And Kevin Spacey was actually quite explicit about that, because what in both of the versions of it, the Kevin Spacey figure breaks the fourth wall. He begins talking to an audience like this and says, do you see what I'm getting away with here? And he kind of sucks us in. Lincoln was enamored of Shakespeare. I will get to Henry IV, particularly Macbeth, or should I say the Scottish play. If you say Macbeth, it's very bad. You have to spin around 3 times, say angels and ministers of grace defend us, and hopefully nothing bad happens to you. But he really loved that play. Nothing equals Macbeth, he said. It is wonderful. And in fact, on one famous occasion, he was returning from a visit to the front in a steamer pulling into Alexandria, and he recited from memory the following speech. It's the speech that Macbeth gives about Duncan. Better be with the dead whom we to gain our peace have sent to peace, than on the torture of the mind to lie in restless ecstasy. Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. Treason has done his worst. Nor steel, nor poison, malice domestic, foreign levy, nothing can touch him further. The visit had been to Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, which had just fallen. 5 days later, in Ford's Theater, treason, in fact, did its worst. Churchill also loved Shakespeare, including some of the more obscure bits. Richard Burton described once playing Hamlet after World War II, and he was told in advance the old man's going to be in the audience. There's only one old man in Britain in 1949. There's Churchill in the front row. And as he's going, he's delivering some of his speeches, he hears this kind of rumbling, and he realizes to his horror that Churchill is reciting all of Hamlet's speeches in parallel with him from memory. And he said, I tried to speed him up, I'd speed it up, I tried to slow it down, I couldn't throw him off. He's a complete nervous wreck. At the intermission, he retires to his dressing room. There's a knock at the door, and there is Winston Churchill, who looks him squarely in the eye and says, "My Lord Hamlet, may I use your washroom?" But the Nazis also liked Shakespeare. And I don't just mean Merchant of Venice, the explicitly anti-Semitic play, although it's more complicated than that. They particularly liked Coriolanus, the story of a lone leader in a fickle mob. Well, what does Shakespeare teach us about politics? I think what you get from studying Shakespeare is the study of political people. That's what Shakespeare's about, not movements or ideologies. He takes some modest swipes at the Puritans, who took some decidedly immodest swipes at him, but Dean Long will get into that. He's not about culture, I think, which he really transcends. After all, this is the most widely translated author in the world. I hope that some of you have seen some of Akira Kurosawa's wonderful movies. He turned Macbeth into Throne of Blood and Lear into Ron. No, Shakespeare's all about character and psychology, and if there's one thing we have learned of late, it is the transcendent importance of character. So how do we learn from Shakespeare? Well, clearly a large part of his power is his ability to fully realize personalities, like Julius Caesar or Henry Bolingbroke or Macbeth. They become more real to us in some ways than people we know, but there's more. One of the themes I explore in the book is the way in which Shakespeare conceives of politics as a form of theater, and I think that's something to really teach us. If you look, for example, at Henry V before the Battle of Agincourt, walking around, just chatting to his troops about nothing in particular, a touch of Harry in the night, that's a large part of what military leadership is all about. Shakespeare develops that metaphor by talking about a play within a play. He often stages that, of course, very famously in Hamlet. But it happens in a lot of plays. Henry V, by the way, is a master at it. He's always creating scenes in which other people are actors, and he is the playwright, the acting coach, and the director. But there are a lot of other cases as well. So too, I think for us, as well as Shakespeare, politics can be understood as theater. There's a stage, there's an audience, there may be a script, there are actors, there's a director. It's a very powerful metaphor. Think about Vladimir Zelensky, the first night of the war. So you had two contrasting scenes. Remember, you had Vladimir Putin dealing with a bunch of terrified subordinates in this kind of gaudy palace of his, and they're sitting like about halfway back from where you folks are now. And Vladimir Zelensky, he's chosen his costume, which is a green military-ish, but not military garb. He has chosen the stage set, the streets of Kyiv. He's got his fellow actors, and he has them crowd in close around him, and he says, we're all here, I'm here, the chief of staff is here, the defense minister is here, and we're going to fight it to the end. And there's actually Shakespearean tones there. It is an extremely powerful metaphor. Now, Shakespeare deals with the full arc of power, and that's how I've organized the book. Usually books on Shakespeare are about one play at a time, and I thought it'd be more interesting to do one on the arc of power, how people acquire power, how they exercise it, and how they lose it or walk away from it. By the way, the story of power very rarely ends happily in Shakespeare. Shakespeare is particularly interested in the politics of courts. Now, that might seem something that's not relevant to us because we don't live in a monarchy, really. But actually, it is a dominant form of politics. The White House is a court. A political campaign is a different kind of court. The seventh floor of the State Department is a court. In fact, when I went to work as counselor of the State Department, a grizzled old diplomat told me, "Welcome to the Knights of the Round Table." In my old office in the NHTSA building, the second floor, it was kind of a ducal court, sort of like what Dean Steinberg has here on the seventh floor, with an imperial court being in Homewood, on the Homewood campus. But they're courts. There's court politics. And you're crazy if you think that there isn't court politics. All human organizations have courts. By the way, this is one of the reasons why I'm very much in favor of people reading the Henry VI plays, because Washington politicians like to think that the play is Henry V and they're in the leading role. You know, miniseries directors like to think it's Richard III with lots of villains, or Macbeth. Journalists, I think, tend to think of Henry IV, I and II, with themselves in the role of Falstaff. Actually, it's more like Henry VI, with all kinds of people. Discontented advisors, clueless heirs, arrogant pretenders, sturdy commanders, scheming politicians, entitled aristocrats, young people on the make, aging veterans hanging on, hopeless fantasists who believe in their own magic, and even a few sociopaths, all struggling for power, and most of them don't do well. Shakespeare exposes to us the issue of motivation. And he does that particularly through the soliloquy. There's a great article out actually in today's Atlantic, which is an author writing about a letter that Arthur Miller, the great playwright, wrote to an undergraduate who was asking about death of a salesman. And he wrote this long letter back to this young woman. And he said, look, this is all taken from Shakespeare. And what he particularly talks about is the soliloquy. So if you will bear with me, I'd like to walk quickly through one soliloquy, which I think is very revealing. It's a soliloquy which is often performed in Richard III, the ultimate bad guy king, right? But it's actually from Henry VI, Part 3, Act 3, Scene 3. There's Richard, Duke of York, who will become Richard III after a whole bunch of murders. But his brother Edward has the throne. Edward is busy philandering. Richard has his brother, Edward has a couple of kids, and he's talking, and in the soliloquy, people speak about the world as they understand it. They may be lying to themselves, but they're not lying to us. Why then, I do but dream on sovereignty, like one that stands upon a promontory and spies a far-off shore where he would tread, wishing his foot were equal with his eye, and chides the sea that sunders him from thence, saying he'll lade it dry to have his way. So do I wish the crown. Well, as a description of ambition, it doesn't lack dignity. We get it. But after describing the crown as being nearly impossible to get, he then asks, what are the alternatives? Could he make it as a lover and make my heaven in a lady's lap? Oh, miserable thought, and more unlikely than to accomplish 20 golden crowns. Why, love forswore me in my mother's womb, and for I should not deal in her soft law, she did corrupt frail nature with some bribe, to shrink mine arm up like a withered shrub, to make it an envious mountain on my back, where sits deformity to mock my body. It's an incredible depiction of sexual frustration and self-loathing, and it culminates in his awareness that he is an utterly unlovable man, which is a chilling thought. And am I then a man to be beloved? Oh, monstrous fault to harbor such a thought. So what was an ambition that we can understand and a predicament that I think we can sympathize with then becomes something monstrous. Then since this earth affords no joy to me, but to command, to check, to overbear such as are a better person than myself, I'll make my heaven to dream upon the crown, and whilst I live to account this world but hell, until my misshaped trunk that bears this head be round impaled with a golden crown. Now, like many power-mad people, and I think I've known a few, he doesn't understand that he won't be satisfied at the end of it. What is motivating him is the desire to acquire the crown. And of course, he uses the word impale, which is not usually a pretty word, if you think about it. His head's going to impale the crown. But of course, it doesn't end there. And that ambition and fantasy becomes something desperate and murderous. He describes himself as one lost in a thorny wood that rends the thorns and is rent with the thorns, seeking a way and straying from the way, not knowing how to find the open air, but toiling desperately to find it out. And he says that he will torment himself to get through that thorny wood, either freeing himself or he will hew his way out with a bloody axe. He then recasts himself as a Machiavellian prince, and indeed he references Machiavelli, and he says, well, I can smile and murder while I smile, and cry content to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions. And by the time it ends, what had been utterly impossible at the beginning of the soliloquy, like 5 minutes earlier, is entirely plausible. Can I do this and cannot get a crown? Tut, were it farther off, I'll pluck it down. We could spend an hour talking about that soliloquy, but I think it just gives you a sense of the power of Shakespeare's ability to get inside another human being. And I've long thought that one of the great political gifts, as a theatrical gift too, but it's a political gift, is the ability to empathize. And we crawl inside Richard III. And we do that with all of Shakespeare's characters, including other real bad guys. Now, if there's one characteristic of Shakespeare that one can emulate in real life, it's what the Greeks called anagnorisis. That's the revealing moment when you realize, oh, that's what this is all about. That's what happens to Cardinal Wolsey. He suddenly goes, oh, that's where I've been all this time. There's a different moment of insight which is delivered not by an actor, but by the chorus at the end of Henry V. So throughout the Henry V, and I'm sure many of you have at least seen the movie versions, Henry V, it was the Battle of Agincourt, he gets the girl, he's a brilliant leader, he's completely inspiring. I personally think he's a scoundrel, but we can talk about that later. And the chorus is the cheerleader, and is always just talking about what an amazing guy this is. And it then says, thus far with rough and all unable pen, our bending author hath pursued the story, in little room confining mighty men, mangling by starts the full course of their glory, small time, but in that small most greatly lived. This star of England, fortune made his sword, by which the world's best garden, that's France, he achieved, and of it left his son imperial lord, Henry VI. In infant bands crowned king of France and England did this king succeed, whose states so many had the managing that they lost France and made his England bleed, which oft our stage hath shown, and for their sake in your fair minds let this acceptance take. Now, what's that all about? We've had this long play about what a heroic figure he is, how eloquent he is, how inspiring he is. And what Shakespeare is teaching us, if we're willing to pay attention to what happens, is yeah, and it was all for naught, because the one thing you couldn't control, Henry, was your own death and what would succeed you. And I think in the world of power, those moments of insight really do come. I sometimes think of that, what is in effect a soliloquy that Richard Nixon gave just before he got on the helicopter to leave the White House, which if you read it, it's a bit of a soliloquy. Now, he kind of shut back up, but there was a moment where he realized, you begin hating other people, you'll destroy yourself. Now, then he kind of closed that up again, but it does happen. Sometimes it's the weaker characters who have that understanding, even as they botch their own handling of power. This will be the last excerpt I'll read, which will probably be a relief to some of you. It comes, and it's from the title of the book, a very famous speech by Richard II, a weak and incompetent king who was deposed by Henry Bolingbroke and then murdered. And he's a very frustrating human being because he's eloquent and he's smart and he's completely incapable and he doesn't have a sense of who he is other than that he's king. By the way, something you do see in Washington too, people who can't transcend whatever their office is or was. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court. And there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little seen to monarchize, be feared, and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which walls about our life were brass impregnable, and humored thus, comes at the last, and with a little pin, bores through his castle wall, and farewell, king. Shakespeare was, as Samuel Johnson said, a mirror to the world. He's ambiguous, and there's a lesson to us in that. As I said, Lincoln loved him, Churchill loved him, so did the Nazis. This past year, I have traveled on a number of occasions to Ukraine, to Israel after October 7th, and to Taiwan, 2 war zones and 1 flashpoint. In each case, I've been very powerfully struck by the importance of individual character in all of its manifestations: courage, dedication, cowardice, arrogance, ambition. It is the stuff of which nations' destinies are made, and that makes Shakespeare all the more useful to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I would love to follow up on your comment that maybe we could talk some more about Henry V. Henry V is someone that I have always loved and admired. I'm actually in the process of, I have a group I'm reading all of Shakespeare with, and in that group, I was surprised to discover half the group, I think, felt like you did, really saw negatives in him. Yeah. And I think one of the things to me that's so remarkable about your book is you mentioned this, that what Shakespeare helps us do is empathize with, all kinds of people, but he also shows us the complexity of people, right? And that's what you're really seeing in Henry V. So talk to us more about that.
Okay, so my view of Henry V is he's a complete rat. So let's start with the beginning of the play. He really owes a lot to Falstaff. There's, who Harold Bloom said is that is the great Shakespearean character, embodies humanity in a certain way. And it begins by, we learn of Falstaff's death off stage. And Falstaff's partner, as we would say now, she may be a prostitute, she may be a hotel keeper, whatever, says it's the king who did him in. And in fact, we've seen that actually at the very end of Henry IV, Part 2, where Falstaff, who is a wicked, fellow, although utterly charming, comes to Henry and wants, a sinecure of some kind. And there's the deadly words that Henry V uses. "I know thee not, old man." These are the words you never want to hear from one of your students, One of the things I always think about, oh my God. I'll say, "Hi, we're my friend." "I know thee not, old man." He sets up this war with France, which he knows is, the play begins also with the bishops, they're thinking, okay, we'll get him to launch this war with France, and that'll get him off our backs, and he won't confiscate him. He turns that around, and he makes them responsible for it, and says, hey, my conscience is clear, which is a trick he always uses. He then sets up a sting for these 3 nobles who had conspired against them, and against, hey, this is not my fault. You guys did, I would give you mercy, I would be merciful. But business is business, as they say in The Godfather. The war is a completely unjust war. He is an inspiring guy. No, unquestioned, the Agincourt speech is great, but what does he say the night before, where the soldiers are going, it's not clear to me this is a just war, and the nobles will all get ransom and stuff. We're going to be chopped to pieces, and we have, families back home. And he goes off in this self-pitying soliloquy, that these peasants don't understand, all the labor that the king engages in so that these, fools can sleep. And of course, they can't sleep. He's dragged them off to a war. And then the next day, it's, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. And everybody falls for it. Everybody falls for it. I fall for it. But actually, you have to put the two speeches together. He's just been calling these people a bunch of fools and idiots. During the middle of the battle, Shakespeare does this all the time, because I think he wants us to be careful readers as well as watchers of the play. He just orders the massacre of all the prisoners. By the way, before that, the Siege of Harfleur, you want a really scary set of threats of sexual violence. It's when he's talking to the mayor of Harfleur, he said, you guys don't surrender, because they haven't been able to storm the place. You cannot stop my soldiers. They're going to rape your virgins. They're going to spit your babies on pikes, and it's not my fault, which is a characteristic refrain. And then he seduces Catherine, the French princess. And this is a guy who we know is actually extremely eloquent, extremely cunning. And he puts on that, I'm just a rough old soldier, God, I don't know really how to express myself. It's sort of, a pretty cheesy version of Jimmy Stewart. And it's baloney, because what he's been doing just before is he has perfectly lucidly threatening, I forget whether it's her uncle, but they're saying, hey, you guys signed the deal where I get France, or we're going to come after you again and kill you. So, and then I think Shakespeare does deliberately stick in the knife at the end. But I think it is a wonderful study, because it's always a mistake, I believe, to fall in love with political people. And I would say, actually, with any leader, you should never fall in love with them. And I think if we pay close attention, Shakespeare will teach us this is why you can't fall in love with them. No, I do prefer his father, who's kind of a sour old guy, but who I think is a political realist. And that's, by the way, Jim, to your point, why he reminds me of Lincoln. Because Lincoln, I think, first could be very cold, extremely cold. But he was a profound realist. My favorite quote from Henry IV is, if these be necessities, why let us meet them like necessities. That's his political philosophy. But in any case, yeah, so that's
So let's go back to Prince Hal, when he was Prince Hal.
Yep.
And you talk a lot about the role and the politician who has experienced life with the common man, who's done what, that there's something in what Prince Hal is doing that he is really understanding, that he's going to gain something from that. So I think it's a really interesting juxtaposition you have between both how that serves him, but then later when you talk about how he, in that night before the battle, is really talking about the fools that are the common men, that he can understand them but not actually, admire them.
I don't think he identifies with
not
them all.
Identify, right.
But he understands their desires, their fears. It's the part of this, they say in Crispin's Day speech is, old men forget, but, you'll remember with advantages. So he's telling, okay, hey, look, I know you guys are going to be telling war stories, and you're going to show your wounds, and you'll say, I was there, and there was Harry the King, and Exeter, and it's, I know a lot of soldiers, and I've known, corporals and sergeants who would go, let's go for it, let's go with this guy. But they're being manipulated by him. I argue in the book that that was a great education for him being in East Cheap. He understood what motivated these people. He did not actually think of them as their brothers, his brothers. I think that's all pretense, but he knew how to make them feel like his brothers. And there's, I think the more I've read Shakespeare, the more I think I detect a kind of fascination with, but also a certain distaste for what power does to people, and how much of it is about manipulation, and what it does to human character, which is why my favorite character in some ways is Prospero in The Tempest, because he decides to walk away from power. He's going to break his staff. He's going to drown his book of spells. And, why does he have to do that? He's a great magician. Why not go back to Milan and do magic tricks? And it's because he realizes that it's made him a rather cramped and unattractive human being, I think.
And we see that often in the soliloquies, right? The honest points where people recognize what it is that's happening to them.
Yeah, and that's why it's such Arthur Miller says, the soliloquies are this is a creation of genius, and I agree.
So I think another thing that's really interesting in your book is the final section that is about the giving up of power, the walking away. And maybe because that is not talked about as much as the acquisition and the wielding of power, but how you look at and understand what it means to either lose it or to walk away from it, which in the case of Prospero is remarkable.
It's foreshadowed a little bit at the beginning of The Tempest, where Prospero, this magician who's been shipwrecked on this island, he'd been deposed basically by his brother with the consent of the king. And he's on this desert island with his daughter, and he finally had all of his enemies are now kind of, he's called up a storm, and they've been sailing nearby, and they're all basically at his mercy. And his daughter has never really understood, what are we doing here? And he's going to explain to her what happened. There's a wonderful, again, it's one of these little things. He says, help me, and he's been conjuring up storms and spirits and stuff. He says, help me off with my magic robe. So the way I interpret that is he cannot speak to her as a father can speak to a daughter and should speak to a daughter while he's wearing his magic robes of power. Right. And he can't even take the robes off himself. And then if you look at the end, he's not looking forward to retirement, something which is, looms larger in my horizon these days. He says, every third thought will be of death, which doesn't sound like a really attractive prospect. But what's interesting there is the Prospero we have at the beginning has a kind of a nasty side to him. Mm-hmm. He is downright brutal towards Caliban, and is basically threatening him with torture. I'll make you'll feel all kinds of cramps and twitches. He chews out Ariel, his spirit. During the course of the play, he's not particularly nice to his future son-in-law. I understand that. I've got two of them. And at the end, what's really interesting is he is actually very gentle towards Ariel, and with Caliban, he who's done various things, he points to him and he says to the king, "Yeah, I acknowledge this one as my own." So in other words, I'm responsible for this guy. And Caliban is quite an unattractive figure in many ways, but he's a much more human figure. It does not buy him full-throated happiness, I think, but he can walk away from it. And in the book, what I do is I do try to weave in other cases. The example I use is George Washington.
I was going to say, bring that back to so, do you see this often in the walking away from power and actually becoming more gentle, or is that the exception?
Well, thank goodness that we have term limits for presidents. George Washington is remarkable because George Washington does it not once but twice. The first time when he loved Shakespeare and he loved theatricals and he fully understood staging. There's just no question about it. And when the war's over, he stages this thing where he returns his commission to the Congress, and again it's theater. The big point: he comes in, he's standing, members of Congress are sitting, and that was done deliberately, even though they all worshiped the man. And he takes his commission and he returns it to them. He could have taken it home and framed it, for the man cave or whatever the equivalent was at Mount Vernon. But he doesn't do that. And the second time is when he steps down from the presidency. And actually on both occasions, George III is reported to have said, if he actually does that, he'll be the greatest man of the age. I think it's very hard. I think it's hard for people in business. It's hard. I think it's hard for somebody who's an effective leader of any really important institution. Knowing when to hang it up, very difficult, very difficult. And it's people talk about this all the time. That people losing that sense of identity. Well, who am I? And somehow playing golf doesn't quite do it. So it's. I think Shakespeare helps point the way there too.
So maybe you could talk a little about how you feel like Shakespeare can help, not just with understanding yourself or something that's happened with a leader, but you talk at one point in the book about kind of that almost seeing where Putin might be going. Yep. So predicting that to what extent is this something that helps us reflect on and understand things versus be able to actually understand where things might be going?
So the story that Dean Long is referring to is, I mentioned I was at the Munich Security Conference, which is a big do for the national security wonks in the world. And this was literally just before the Russians launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And it was fascinating to me how many of my European friends, very experienced people, it's not going to happen, or if it happens, he's just going to take a piece of Ukraine. He's not crazy. This is very rational. And I had my doubts. And the reason why I had my doubts, and it was no more than having doubts, but I had my doubts, was I just reread Richard III, I don't know, the 8th or 9th time. And the thing about Richard III is in the first 3 acts of the play, he is committing murders. He has his brother drowned in a giant cask of sweet wine, which may not be the worst way to go. But in Act 4, he commits the really big one, which is he has his 2 nephews murdered in the tower. And when that happens, until this point, he's been subtle, he's been careful, he's been witty, he's kind of done things indirectly. And at that one, his deputy, Buckingham, who he's charged with this, kind of goes, and he just says, "I want the bastards dead and wish it done suddenly. Do you understand me? Speak." So something has changed inside him. And the guy who was subtle and careful and indirect has changed. And my feeling was something like that with Putin. But I think that the thing that Shakespeare has to offer us in this respect is, there's a school of thought, and I think Lincoln actually believed this, that Shakespeare is better read than watched. I've had friends, including professors of literature, who told me that that's their view too, that it's better read than watched. They're both wonderful in different ways. And what the reading of Shakespeare teaches you to do is to read what people say and what they do very carefully. And I'm not so sure we do that all the time. Mm-hmm. Pay attention to what they say in their speeches. Pay attention to how they carry themselves or how they stage things and stuff like that. All that really matters. And I think, in theory, I'm still a political scientist, but I kind of became a renegade long ago. I think we sometimes take too much of that framework where you're looking at large impersonal forces and organizations, and that's all very important. I get that. But I think being able to read character by kind of minute examination of what somebody says and what they do is a real challenge.
So how do you read character when you have the possibility of the, kind of feigning something? We see that right in Hamlet, the feigning of his, has he gone crazy or not? The Prince Hal who says, from the beginning again, this is not about youthfulness who then grows up and matures, and you point that out in the book. It is about someone who is very thoughtfully saying, I'm going to appear this way because it will then have all the more effect when I become king and I become serious. And so we see these in Shakespeare, the usefulness of being able to feign being one thing when in fact you're doing something else. How do we help? How do we then see through that when what we're trying to do is identify real character?
So I think Shakespeare, what the totality of the plays show you is there's always a tell. The mask always slips somehow. Nobody can really, no actor can really live a role for more than the period that they're on stage. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why he puts in all of these plays, these little things which you go, oh, there's something going on here. And I think that's how you do it. I mean, again, Dean Steinberg may want to jump in on this. I am always surprised by the way in which people often don't pay attention to things people have written or said. I mean, with Putin, he wrote this piece which is at the time looked ridiculous and in retrospect looks sinister on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people. You read that, say, yeah, he wants to take Ukraine. He doesn't think these guys deserve to be an independent country. And people tend not to take some of this seriously. It's part of the way in which in our world, if you use the word rhetoric, it means, insincere speech.
Right.
As opposed to the possibility that people are actually revealing themselves. And I think that's really the sort of the Shakespearean point. Nobody can really nobody can really conceal themselves consistently over a long period of time. And what happens instead is people read into them what they want to read into them. Right. I think that's the more dangerous moment.
Well, I'd like to make sure we have some time for the audience to ask questions. So let's do that, and then we'll talk a little about what we've brought with us today
those
as
marvelous,
well.
that marvelous collection you have up there.
So we have people with microphones. If anyone would like to, if you want to make your way to the aisle, they'll hold the microphone up for you.
I think they're afraid of
Don't
triggering
be
another
shy.
soliloquy.
Thanks, Dr. Cohen. Henry Newsom. I've got a question for you about, clearly, I haven't read the book yet, but I've come to 2 of your talks on it, so I figure if I can go to 2 or 3 more.
Have you bought it yet?
That's coming after talk number 3. I'll keep stalking you.
You have to understand, authors care about whether people read their books. What they really care about, though, is do they buy their books?
Right. I'm curious about, obviously it's about Shakespeare as a political observer. I'm curious as to his works in the political context of Elizabeth and James I and all that's going on then, and to what extent was he having a dialogue or even enlisted by or trying to ingratiate some of the political leaders of that fascinating time of England, and really England's, with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, arrival on the world stage.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating time. What's interesting is, on the one hand, we know that Shakespeare existed. For those of you who have any lingering doubts, there's a great book by James Shapiro, a wonderful Shakespeare scholar at Columbia, called Contested Will. And it just, I can go into chapter and verse, but Shakespeare was Shakespeare, and he wrote Shakespeare. But that said, there's a lot we don't know. We have business kinds of letters and documents that he wrote, but we have no letters. And all entirely appropriate, because that was a very dangerous time. And so he wasn't going to confide political thoughts, I think, to paper. He was close to the court because theater was a new form. And it really operated under aristocratic or royal patronage. He was initially actor owner in The King Chamberlain's Men, and then the King's Men. So in other words, the sponsors were the king in one case, a high-level aristocrat in the other. The plays all had to be reviewed by an official who had the wonderful title, the Master of the Revels, which I always thought that would be a great job to have, the Master of the Revels. But we know that he was close to the court, but we don't know a whole lot more than that. Now, there is one famous brush that he has, and that is when the Duke of Essex plotted against Queen Elizabeth, and he had Shakespeare and his troupe perform Richard II, which is about a weak and incompetent king being deposed. And Elizabeth is reputed to have said, it's not clear that she actually said this, to somebody else, "Know ye not, I am Richard." And Essex ended up paying the ultimate price for this. There's some thought that Shakespeare may actually have been working for the Elizabethan Secret Service in all this. But I think the thing is, I think he deliberately refrained from politics, not just out of self-preservation, but because he's an observer of humanity. And, he's a mirror of the world, and as people have said. And that's what he was. And so I don't think he wanted to take any kind of political positions. He wanted to observe it very closely. And of course, in addition to his personal experience, he's also just reading, and he's like a magpie. He's kind of picking up bits and pieces from the Greeks, from the Romans, from such histories as there were, and refashioning them into things that would work dramatically.
And you talk about that some in your afterwards.
Yeah.
The idea that Shakespeare, from your perspective, really he doesn't have a point of view he's trying
Right.
to get across
Right. And
about a political point of view.
Right, and I think that's very important for us as we read him, that we not try to, for example, I think it's silly to say, as some people do, well, he's an apologist for the Tudors. No, actually, if you read Henry VIII, you can read that in a way that's quite critical of Henry VIII, the king. I'm sure he was being careful, but in the same way, if you read Merchant of Venice, you say, well, he's an anti-Semite. First, he probably didn't know any Jews firsthand, but that's way too simple because Shylock gets all the good speeches.
Right.
And, it's the Christians who look bad at the end, and look worse in many ways than Shylock does. So I think it's a terrible mistake to try to read into him motivations that the nature of things we just don't know anything about.
And many modern stagings will show Shylock, for instance, as the sympathetic character.
Oh, yeah.
We see this, and you talk some about it in your book, the many different ways in which plays can be interpreted,
Yeah.
which shows that breadth depending on what you focus on.
Yeah.
What is it that comes out in the play?
And I think that is one of the reasons to see Shakespeare as well as read him. You can do quite amazing things on the stage that, I'll just, if I could, just remember there was a staging of Tempest where Ariel, who flies around, is usually flies around with guy wire, the thin guy wire, so it looks like Ariel is really floating around. Mm-hmm. They did one where Ariel is kind of connected to whatever is up there with a thick hawser. You're going, it's a really big, thick rope. And I'm going, that's kind of clunky. And then it became clear at the end, because at the very end, when Prospero gives, as he has promised, Ariel his or her, it's not clear which, freedom, all of a sudden this big rope released. It falls from above and it released from whatever the harness is that the Ariel character is carrying, and Ariel walks off stage. And so there's a beautiful interpretation there that, yes, Ariel, you get your freedom, but it means now you can't fly,
Right.
which I thought was lovely.
Nice.
Hi there, John Buchiever, MIPP 2004. I wonder what you think Shakespeare would make of the predicament we're in this country.
I can't deal with those questions well because I can tell you what I think, but I can't tell you what Shakespeare would think because it's such a different world. I think he would be not amused, but bemused by some of the characters in our political life. I think, and I'm not going to get political here, but I think people often reach for the really, say people who hate Donald Trump, which is a fair number, say, okay, this is Richard III, or this is Macbeth, the ultimate baddie. And I think that sort of stuff is way overdone. For those of you who were going to ask that question or approach me later on, all I will say to you is read Cymbeline and consider the character of Cloten. And since probably very few have read Cymbeline, I can escape off the stage without making a political comment.
Do we have, I know we have someone here. Do we have someone back here too? I think right there, yeah. And then we'll come up here.
Hi. Shakespeare isn't obviously expert at character because, I mean, that's what plays are all about is characters. Can you shed some light on the distinction between character and personality? Like, are there some discrepancies somehow or differences between character and personality in Shakespeare?
That's a wonderful question. I can give you a personal read. I'm not sure I can give you a read that necessarily reflects Shakespeare. I'd have to think about it hard. For me, when I think about what character is all about, character is how people behave under pressure. That's when they're of some kind comes out. Whereas personality can be a whole bunch of attributes which don't necessarily tell you about that. It's like, there's a famous definition of integrity, which is what you do when somebody else is not watching, when you can get away with it. I think this is very true in public life. That's when I think about political figures, actually the first thing I think about is character. One of the things I've always hated is when people talk about somebody in this Washington world that we inhabit and say, so-and-so is very smart. And my reaction is always, and some of my former students here will have heard me say this, smart is really cheap. There are companies that will rent you smart. What you cannot rent by definition is character. And I think that's different from personality. Personality, you're more introverted, extroverted. That doesn't necessarily tell you anything. Character tells you something about really what's inside that human being. But that's a personal view. I don't know that I could really give you a firmly grounded Shakespearean answer.
Eliot, it's a terrific book. I want to build on, I thought where Jim was going with his first question. You have a couple of quotes in there by Lincoln's law partner that I'd never read before that illuminated Lincoln. So the old compare and contrast Prince Hal and Lincoln, leveraging those, because I thought those were really interesting and different than anything I'd ever seen written about Lincoln.
So Willie Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, who at one level worshipped him and I think envied him, it said two things about Lincoln which have always stuck with me, which I do quote in there. One is Abraham Lincoln's ambition was a little engine that never stopped ticking. And I think that applies to Henry IV. My reading of Henry IV is, even when he's Henry the Bolingbroke, he was always an ambitious man. But the other one, which is, he says, any man who ever took Abraham Lincoln for a simple man found himself lying on his back in a ditch. It's also true. I mean, Lincoln was a Shakespearean figure in many ways. He was extremely complicated. I mean, one of my favorite examples of that is after, sometime at the very beginning of 1863, he writes this incredibly touching letter to a 16-year-old girl who had lost her father in the war, who had been somebody he knew. I think her name was Fanny Price, was that it? It's a beautiful letter. You can find it anywhere. It's just an amazing thing. Here's this man. He's the president of the United States. And he takes the time to console this 16-year-old girl who's grieving for her father, and he does it beautifully. The language it's just magnificent. But then you just had the Battle of Fredericksburg, in which Ambrose Burnside, not for the first and not for the last time in his career, really blundered big time, and lost 10,000 men charging Marie's Heights in Fredericksburg. You can go to the battlefield if you want, 13 times. And they take the position, but it's meaningless. It's just a bloodbath. It's just a stupid, stupid bloodbath. But how does Lincoln react to it? He says, well, if the Battle of Fredericksburg were fought every day for a week of days, the Army of Northern Virginia would be destroyed, and the Army of the Potomac would still be a mighty host, and the war would be won. We do not yet have a general who understands the arithmetic, but when we do, the end of the war will be at hand. So in other words, his complaint about Burnside is he wasn't ruthless enough in expending his men's lives. It's the same guy. It's the same guy. It's quite remarkable. He was a man of tremendous internal contradictions, I think. And I think he knew it. I mean, I think it has something to do with his melancholy.
We had back here, I think.
Hello. First of all, I've never met anyone who doesn't like Henry V. I also don't like Henry V. So that's really helpful for me, just in general, of my mindset in Shakespeare. Second of all, even though I don't like Henry V, I do feel compelled to ask you, do you really think Hal owes something to Falstaff when it's been very clear, I think, that Falstaff has been equally using him and then is asking for a position of power he has no position asking for?
What an interesting question. So I think he does owe him something. First, because he has learned much more from Falstaff, which is invaluable to him as king. He has encouraged Falstaff. There's that famous sort of play within a play where I think Falstaff is pretending to be his father. He is the king, and in my view at least, kings should be gracious. Even deans have to be gracious, even though it hurts. But the other thing is the way he does it. I know thee not, old man. Let's talk about this later, shall we?
Sounds great.
I
would love to.
No. I mean, that's what Henry could have said to Falstaff. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. No, that's not what I meant. No, but it is a brutal remark, which I think is done very deliberately. And in fact, Hal says something to this effect, or Henry says something to this effect. He's going to show everybody, all of you people here, that he's not Prince Hal anymore. This is King Henry. This guy, that's the past. Kings have to do that. But as a human being, it's kind of a scummy thing to do.
So over on this side here? Yeah.
Well, because Hal says, "Mistake me not to think I am the thing I was."
Yep.
It's one of my favorite quotes in that play. So I actually have done some research specifically on the villains of Shakespeare. So I would love your thoughts. For any of you who've seen Patrick Page's.
Oh, what a wonderful.
Yes. So I'm from the Shakespeare Theater, so we just did that. So he talks very specifically about the quote from Hamlet. There's nothing neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so.
Yeah.
And I'd love your thoughts on that in the political climate.
So this was a wonderful, it's now I think a show in New York, but he did it for the Shakespeare Theater. It's The Devils Be Here or something like that. All the Devils Are Here. All the Devils Are Here. Patrick Page is a wonderful, wonderful Shakespearean actor, and it was basically about an hour-long show in which all the juiciest parts of all of Shakespeare's villains, and it was worth the $25 for what you guys charge, but it's all in a good cause. I thought actually the most important thing about the Patrick Page's thing is he talked about sociopathy. And I've dealt with a couple of sociopaths during the course of my career. And I think he gets them right. I mean, that, sociopaths are people who don't have this kind of, most of us have inside us something that says true, false, right, wrong. And we may do the wrong thing, but we know there's this little thing in there going, that's really wrong. I'm going to do it anyway. And then there are the people who, they really don't care. I mean, it just doesn't register. And I literally have dealt with sociopaths. When I was an assistant dean many years ago at Harvard, I had at least 2 genuine sociopaths. And I think he captures something about Shakespeare's villains. But one of the things that's, and I think he particularly talks about Iago in Othello as a sociopath. Because the great thing about, one of the things he points out about Iago is, who destroys Othello, who's basically been quite good to him by making Othello suspect his wife Desdemona, and he kills her, and all ends very badly. You never know why he did it. And Iago is, as he's, at the very end, Iago is being dragged off, and basically the chief folks in Venice are saying, okay, torture him and torture him good. And you just know Iago's not going to confess, because there isn't actually anything to confess. It was just pure malice. And some of the villains are sociopaths, but what strikes me about them is they're all different. So the 2 really big baddies, Richard III and Macbeth, the thing that strikes me about them is they all proceed from a kind of a psychological place which we can sympathize with. Richard III's deformities, which, by the way, are probably exaggerated now that they finally dug Richard III up from a car park in Lancaster, which is quite an amazing story. So you sympathize with that point of departure, but where he's basically monstrous almost from the very beginning. Macbeth is in many ways more interesting, because Macbeth, he knows it's wrong, but he's going to do it, and he then deceives himself. That's why I talk a lot about magic in the book and how people believe in magic, which I think, by the way, continues to be true. It just takes different forms today. But then with Macbeth, one murder leads to another murder, and it basically destroys him as a human being. And so you get the tomorrow creeps this petty pace. And I think that's very true as well. So there are these tremendous varieties of evil. But I don't think that Shakespeare meant that, I don't think he was a moral relativist, and so it's just saying, well, it's only, if you think it's bad to, murder your 2 nephews to get them out of the way, that, some people will think it's a bad thing, some people will think it's okay. I think it's more almost like a sort of a Stoic kind of reflection for oneself, that you'll, the adversities you encounter are just, it's not entirely in what you think about them, but has a lot to do with them, with what they are. But many happy evenings at the Shakespeare Theater, I want you to know.
We have here and here then.
Dr. Cohen, good evening. Thank you very much. I take a personal note to second Patrick Page's All the Devils Are Here. I happened to see that in New York City the weekend before last, and it is phenomenal. Question, one topic we haven't hit on, obviously, tonight is the aura of power. And my question is, especially in DC where the aura of power is very palpable and tangible and real, your thoughts on Shakespeare's use of the aura as a vehicle for, and how that might play into our modern day leaders who actually want to get honest counsel and advice, and counselors who want to give solid advice, And the caveat being, I'm curious what you pulled your punches in Bush 43 in the Oval. You made comment in your book. I was wondering what that's about, but maybe that's for later. But I was just curious how the aura of power in Shakespeare's writings relates to some of what we deal with in Washington.
So I think in Shakespeare, the thing to remember about the Elizabethan stage is it doesn't have stage sets, really. It has very, very few props. It's very bare. By the way, Arthur Miller talks about this too, which he thinks is a good thing. So the aura of power has to be conveyed by how people act. And it's where you really see it is in how courtiers kind of position themselves in dealing with the king. And that's, you see who are the ones who are not going to speak anything remotely like truth to power. Again, without giving away too much, if you look at the courtiers around Cloten, this figure in Cymbeline, you see the courtiers are kind of playing along with him, even they don't particularly care for him. I think in our world, the physicality of power makes a big difference. I mean, if I always thought, as I used to ask students, who do you think is the most corrupting figure in the White House? And depending on the administration, they would name somebody they didn't like. And I said, no, it's the White House photographer. Because if you walk into the West Wing, there on the walls, what do you have? It's always pictures of the president in striking heroic attitudes of one kind or another, or being worshipped by adoring throngs. And unless the president get bored by any of this, they rotate the photographs every 2 weeks with more photographs like that. And it's a mistake to think that doesn't, somehow doesn't somehow affect people. It does. And walking into the Oval, for sure it does. So just a quick story on that. I was asked to meet with the president a couple of times. This is before the surge in Iraq, so this is 2006. It's before I went into government. And go into the details, but the first time I was there, I walked out there, I said, I pulled my punches. And I was invited back a second time. And because our son was about to deploy there as an infantry officer, I said, I'm going to think about that for a minute before I walk into that room. And it did give me the courage to say, I think you need a different commanding general there, and this is why. And that, and then I was backed up by a number of other people. I think they were already thinking along these ways, so I don't, I think if I'd been run over by a truck, before that second meeting, I think history would have been the same. But it took that to kind of get me over the hurdle. And I talked to Josh Bolton, not John Bolton, Josh Bolton, the president's chief of staff afterwards. He said, you wouldn't, and I said, I really, this was towards the end of the administration, we were just chatting and in his office, and I said, I really felt that way about that first meeting, and I felt I did a bit better in the second meeting. He said, I can't tell you how many people, senators, governors, they come into this office, they're waiting to go into the Oval to meet the president. They said, I'm going to tell him, and then they walk into that office and they turn into pussycats. So the aura of power is real, and I think any of us here have had an executive position. No, you got to fight to get the truth. It doesn't come walking in your door.
So one last question here.
Thank you very much. Eliot, perhaps a related question, if we can go back to Lincoln as we sit here just a few blocks from where he was assassinated. You've spoken about objectively Lincoln as a Shakespearean character, but if we think of the adjective Shakespearean, then as you've described, people consumed with power, megalomania. Can you share any insights on perhaps how Lincoln subjectively processed Shakespeare? Because we have the Doris Kearns Goodwin concept, team of rivals, and this very benign Spielberg type figure, but any insights on how Lincoln himself might have processed Shakespeare during his presidency?
So let me go back to my remarks. Let's think about this. What are the lines that he quotes from Macbeth as he's coming back from visiting the front? Better be with the dead, whom we, to gain our peace, have sent to peace, than on the torture of the mind to lie. Better be with the dead, whom we, to gain our peace, have sent to peace, than on the torture of the mind to lie in restless ecstasy. I think Lincoln understood very well the amount of human suffering that he was very deliberately inflicting, that he was responsible for. And I think that tormented him. There's a reason why that quote somehow resonated him. We've sent to peace to gain our peace. And I think not all political people know themselves. I think Lincoln knew himself. I don't think at one level, I don't think he was the kind of man who would be wringing his hands, but he, I think, grimly accepted what he had to do. And that was true all the way through. I mean, at the very beginning of the Civil War, he says, if the tug is going to come, let it come now. And there was a real limit to what kind of compromise he was open to with the South. But he understood the human price of it, and he had a kind of Shakespearean complexity about him, and he accepted that as human nature. That, I think, is really the key thing.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank all of you.
Thank you.
So we really want to thank you for all of your expertise and insight and the opportunity to have this event. So I want to tell everyone a little about what will be happening next, and also to say thank you and acknowledge both SAIS that has helped with this event and the Sheridan Libraries that I am the dean of, and one of our libraries is Irene and Richard Ferry Library that is downstairs, and we want to make sure that if you're interested in other events, we would love you to get involved with our Friends of the Library group. There are brochures around and staff who will talk to you about that. So we have several things that we brought. It would not be a library event if we didn't think about what kinds of library resources do we have. And so we brought some wonderful things, and Dr. Earl Havens and Margaret Burry, both from the Sheridan Libraries, are here to talk to you about them. We have a prompt book. Now, we ended up really kind of starting with the prompt book, which is of Hamlet. We use that as a theme for what we would bring here from our collection. So the prompt book is from the 18th century, and it was a book used. This is very, very rare for doing productions of the play. And you will see huge passages just marked out and all sorts of changes being put into it. The next book we have, and I want to give the name of it. I'm not going to give you the actual full name of it because it goes on and on and on. It's a Puritan book. And so it's one of those things, the entire front page is the title. But the short title is The Histriomastic. And it is, as you get down into the title, about how the popular stage plays are sinful, heathenish, lewd, ungodly spectacles, and the most pernicious corruption, and that the profession of play poets, of stage players, together with the penning, acting, and frequently of stage players, are unlawful, infamous, and beseeming Christians. So that's a 1,000-page book talking about how awful, and especially the histories, all the terrible people that are in them. Then we have two absolutely beautiful books that when you think of how you can stage Shakespeare in so many different ways. You can also present Shakespeare visually in so many different ways. So one is the Cranach Press book from 1930. This was printed in the Weimar Republic. That is, again, Shakespeare, it's Hamlet, but it is Shakespeare's Hamlet in the center with around it the original sources from which it was taken. So really going way back to early times and the source of that story. And so that's just an absolutely beautiful, example of printing. And then the last piece we have is from 1949, and it is a woodblock print copy of Hamlet, not the full play. You'll see it really is, it's what maybe today we might call a graphic novel. It is a very visual depiction of the story with individual quotes scattered throughout, and it's just an absolutely marvelous kind of interpretation of Shakespeare, of Hamlet. My favorite part being that in the curtains, in the scene in which Polonius gets stabbed and Hamlet is speaking with Gertrude, the curtains behind her have this giant serpent on it. So you have several images of her kind of the serpent dragon wings coming out from her. So it's just a beautiful interpretation. So we would love you to come and take a look at these. At the same time, we have the opportunity to purchase copies of the book. As Eliot said, we definitely want to encourage that. And he will also be signing copies of that book. So thank you to East City Bookshop that has arranged for that. And then in the adjoining rooms, back behind you, we actually have, which is I think where you'll be to sign the books, we have light refreshments. The only thing that we ask is that you not bring them in near our rare books. But besides that, we hope that you will stay and enjoy both these, enjoy the refreshments, have a chance to get your book signed, and perhaps continue the conversation with Professor Cohen. So thank you so much.
Thank you.